Lucy's new neighbor. Lucy lived in a small, quiet neighborhood. She liked her home because it was peaceful and she knew everyone who lived nearby. One day she noticed something different. A moving truck was parked in front of the house next door. Lucy looked out her window and saw an older lady with a big, floppy hat and a friendly smile. She was carrying a small box, and next to her was a little orange cat walking around curiously. I guess I have a new neighbor, Lucy thought. She was curious about the lady and her cute cat, so she decided to say hello. The next morning, Lucy walked over to the house. The old lady was in her front yard, trying to arrange some flowers. Her cat sat nearby, watching a butterfly. Lucy smiled and said, "Hello, my name is Lucy. I live next door." The lady looked up and smiled warmly. "Hello, dear, I'm Mrs. Brown. It's so nice to meet you. And this is my cat, Ginger," she said, pointing to the little orange cat. Ginger meowed softly, and Lucy bent down to pet her. Mrs. Brown seemed kind, but Lucy noticed that she looked a little confused as she placed her flowers in the wrong spots. A few days later, Lucy was sitting at home, reading a book, when she heard a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Brown, holding a pair of keys. "Lucy, I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, "but I can't find my house keys. Can you help me look for them?" Lucy was surprised. "But aren't you holding them?" she asked, pointing to the keys in Mrs. Brown's hand. Mrs. Brown looked down at her hand and laughed. "Oh dear, you're right. I'm holding them. I guess I'm a little forgetful." She chuckled softly and thanked Lucy before heading back home. Lucy smiled to herself. Mrs. Brown was sweet, but she was clearly forgetful. Lucy didn't mind helping her, though. She liked Mrs. Brown's cheerful attitude, and Ginger, the little cat, always made her smile. As the days went by, Lucy got used to hearing a knock on her door. Mrs. Brown often needed help finding things. One day it was her glasses. Another day it was her phone. And sometimes she couldn't even find Ginger, her own cat. One afternoon, Lucy was outside watering her plants when Mrs. Brown rushed over, looking worried. "Lucy, I can't find Ginger. I've looked everywhere in the house, but she's gone," Mrs. Brown said with concern in her voice. Lucy put down her watering can and nodded. "Don't worry, Mrs. Brown. We'll find her." They both started looking around the neighborhood, calling Ginger's name. "Ginger, Ginger, where are you?" Lucy called out, hoping the cat would appear. After a few minutes, Lucy heard a soft meow coming from a nearby tree. She looked up and saw Ginger sitting on a low branch, looking down at them calmly. Lucy smiled and pointed. "There she is. She's just sitting in the tree." Mrs. Brown looked up and sighed in relief. "Oh, thank goodness. I don't know how she gets into these silly places." Lucy gently reached up, grabbed Ginger, and handed her back to Mrs. Brown. "Here you go," she said. Mrs. Brown gave Lucy a big smile. "Thank you so much, dear. I don't know what I would do without you." From that day on, Lucy and Mrs. Brown spent more time together. Lucy didn't mind helping Mrs. Brown find her lost things. In fact, she enjoyed it. Every time she helped, they would sit down afterward, drink some tea, and talk about their day. Mrs. Brown told Lucy stories about her life, about when she was younger, and about all the places she had visited. Lucy loved hearing these stories, and Mrs. Brown always seemed happy to share them. One morning, there was another knock at Lucy's door. She opened it, expecting to help Mrs. Brown find something again. But this time, Mrs. Brown was holding a small cake in her hands. "Good morning, Lucy. I wanted to thank you for all your help," she said. "You've been such a wonderful neighbor, and I baked this cake for you." Lucy was touched. "Thank you, Mrs. Brown. That's so kind of you," she said, accepting the cake. It was small, but it smelled delicious. They sat together on Lucy's porch, eating the cake and chatting about the weather. Ginger, as usual, was nearby, watching the birds in the yard. As they talked, Lucy realized how much she enjoyed having Mrs. Brown as a neighbor. Yes, Mrs. Brown was a little forgetful, but she was also kind, funny, and full of interesting stories. And Lucy always felt good helping her. Over time, Lucy and Mrs. Brown became very close. They didn't just see each other when Mrs. Brown lost something. They started spending time together just because they liked each other's company. They would go for walks in the park, sit in the garden together, and sometimes bake cookies in the kitchen, with Ginger always close by. One afternoon, as they were sitting in the garden, Mrs. Brown turned to Lucy and said, "You know, Lucy, I was a little nervous when I moved here. I didn't know anyone, but now I'm so glad to have you as my neighbor. You've been such a good friend to me." Lucy smiled warmly. "I'm glad you're my neighbor too, Mrs. Brown. I've really enjoyed spending time with you and Ginger." Mrs. Brown laughed. "And thank you for always helping me find my things. I don't know what I'd do without you." Lucy smiled. She had learned something important over the past few months. Friendships can start in unexpected ways. Sometimes they start with simple acts of kindness, like helping a neighbor find her glasses or her cat. And sometimes those little acts of kindness can turn into something much bigger, something like a wonderful friendship. As the sun set that evening, Lucy looked over at Mrs. Brown and Ginger, feeling grateful for her new friends. She realized that helping others, even in small ways, can bring people closer together and make life brighter. And from that day on, Lucy knew that no matter what Mrs. Brown lost, her keys, her glasses, or even her cat, she would always be happy to help, because helping a friend was always worth it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button to stay updated on future content. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think or what you'd like to see next. And if you want to stay connected, make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks again for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next video.